Hey folks, so I'm finally coming back to Tamora Pierce's first test. I apologize for taking so long in between reading the first chapter and the second one. Life happens, right? Anyway, so I'm gonna pick up where I left off with Kel. She has now decided to join the pages. She's accepting the probationary period. So let's see what happens next. This is chapter 2, Not So Welcome. Wilden of Cavall nodded to Baron Piers, but his eyes were on Kel. He looked her over from top to toe, taking in every wrinkle and spot in her tunic and breeches, and the fading bruise around her eye. Kel met his gaze squarely. The training master was handsome, for all that he was completely bald on top. He wore what was left of his light brown hair cropped very short. A scar so red and puffy it had to be recent ran from the corner of his eye across his right temple to dig a track through his hair to his ear. His right arm rested in a sling. His eyes were brown, his mouth wide. His chin was square with a hint of a cleft in it. His big hands were marked with scars. He dressed simply in a pale blue tunic, a white shirt, and dark blue hose. She couldn't see his feet behind the big desk, but she suspected that his shoes were as sensible as the rest of him. Even the Yamanis would say he's got too much stone in him, she thought, looking at the scuffed toes of her boots. He needs water to balance his nature. Peering through her lashes at the training master, she added, lots of water. A century or two of it, maybe. Wilden drummed his fingers on the desktop. At last he smiled tightly. Be seated, please, both of you. Kel and her father obeyed. Wilden took his own seat. Well, Keladry, is it? She nodded. You understand that you are here on sufferance. You have a year in which to prove that you can keep up with the boys. If you do not satisfy me on that count, you will go home. He's never said that to any boy, Kel thought, glad that her face would not show her resentment. He shouldn't be saying it to me. She kept her voice polite as she answered, Yes, my lord. You will get no special privileges or treatment, despite your sex. Wilden's eyes were stony. I will not tolerate flirtations. If there is a boy in your room, the door must be open. The same is true if you are in a boy's room. Should you disobey, you will be sent home immediately. Kel met his eyes. Yes, sir. She was talkative enough with her friends, but not with outsiders. The chill that rose from Wilden made her even quieter. Piers shifted in his seat. My daughter is only 10, Lord Wilden. She is a bit young for that kind of thing. My experience with females is that they begin early, the training master said flatly. He ran a blunt-tipped finger down a piece of paper. It says here that you claim no magical gift, stated Lord Wilden. Is that so? Kel nodded. Lord Wilden put down the paper and leaned forward, clasping his hands on his neatly ordered desk. In your father's day, the royal household always dined in the banquet hall. Now our royal family dines privately for the most part. On great holidays and on special occasions, feasts are held with the sovereigns, nobles, and guests in attendance. The pages are required to serve at such banquets. Also, you are required to run errands for any lord or lady who asks. Has she a servant with her? He asked Kel's father. No, Piers replied. Very well. Palace staff will tend to her rooms. Have you any questions? Wilden asked Kel. Yes, she wanted to say. Why won't you treat me like you treat the boys? Why can't you be fair? She kept it to herself. Growing up in a diplomat's house, she had learned how to read people. A good look at Wilden's square, stubborn face, with its hard jaw, had told Kel that words would mean nothing to this man. She would have to prove to him that she was as good as any boy. And she would. No questions, my lord, she told him quietly. There is a chamber across the hall for your farewells, Wilden told Piers. Selma will come for Keladry and guide her to her assigned room. No doubt her baggage is already there. He looked at Kel. Unpack your things neatly. When the supper bell rings, stand in the hall with the new boys. Sponsors, older pages who show the new ones how things are done, must be chosen before we go down to the mess. After Kel said goodbye to her father, she found Selma waiting for her in the hall. The woman was short and thin, with frizzy brown hair and large dark eyes. She wore the palace uniform for women servants, a dark skirt and white blouse. A large ring laden with keys hung from her belt. As she took Kel to her new room, Salma asked if Kel had brought a personal servant. When the girl replied that she hadn't, Salma told her, "In that case, I'll assign a servant to you. We bring you hot water for wash-up and get your fire going in the morning. We also do your laundry and mending, make beds, sweep, and so on. And if you play any tricks on the servants, you'll do your laundry and bed making for the rest of the year. It's not our job to look after weapons, equipment, or armor, mind. That's what you're here to learn." She briskly led the way through one long hall as she talked. Now they passed a row of doors. Each bore a piece of slate with a name written in chalk. "That's my room," Salma explained, pointing. "The ground floor here is the pages' wing. Squires are the next floor up. If you need supplies or special cleaning and sewing, or if you are ill, come to me." Kel looked at her curiously. "My brothers didn't mention you." "Tim and Greendale, our headman, reorganized service here 6 years ago," Salma replied. "I was brought in 5 years back, just in time to meet your brother Connell. Don't worry, I won't hold it against you." Kel smiled wryly. Connell had that effect on people. Salma halted in front of the last door in the hall. There was no name written on the slate. "This is your room," she remarked. "I told the men to put your things here." She brushed the slate with her fingertips. "Your name has been washed off. I have to get my chalk. You may as well unpack." "Thank you," Kel said. "No need to thank me," was Salma's calm reply. "I do what they pay me to." She hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, even if it's just a sympathetic ear, call me." She rested a warm hand on Kel's shoulder for a moment, then walked away. Entering her room, Kel shut the door. When she turned, a gasp escaped before she locked her lips. She surveyed the damage. The narrow bed was overturned. Mattress, sheets, and blankets were strewn everywhere. The drapes lay on the floor, and the shutters hung open. 2 chairs, a bookcase, a pair of night tables, and an oak clothes press were also upended. The desk must have been too heavy for such treatment, but its drawers had been dumped onto the floor. Her packs were opened, and their contents tumbled out. Someone had used her practice glaive to slash and pull down the wall hangings. On the plaster wall, she saw written, "No girls, go home, you won't last." Kel took deep breaths until the storm of hurt and anger that filled her was under control. Once that was done, she began to clean up. The first thing she checked was the small wooden box containing her collection of Yamani porcelain lucky cats. She had a dozen or so, each a different size and color, each sitting with one paw upraised. The box itself was dented on one corner, but its contents were safe. Her mother had packed each cat in a handkerchief to keep it from breaking. That's something, at least, Kel thought. But what about next time? Maybe she ought to ship them home. As she gathered up her clothes, she heard a knock. She opened her door a crack. It was Salma. The minute the woman saw her face, she knew something was wrong. "Open," she commanded. Kel let her in and shut the door. "You were warned this kind of thing might happen?" Salma asked finally. Kel nodded. "I'm cleaning up." "I told you it's our job to perform a warrior. It's your job to perform a warrior's task. We do this kind of work," Salma replied. "Leave this to me. By the time you come back from supper, it will be as good as new. Are you going to change clothes?" Kel nodded. "Why don't you do that? It's nearly time for you to wait outside. I'll need your key once you're done in here." Kel scooped up the things she needed and walked into the next room. Small and bare, it served as a dressing room and a bathroom. The privy was behind a door set in the wall. There was little in here to destroy, but the mirror and the privy seat were soaked. Kel shut the door. Before she had seen her room, she had planned to wear a tunic and breeches, as she had for the journey. She'd thought that if she was to train as a boy, she ought to dress like one. They were also much more comfortable. Now she felt differently. She was a girl. She had nothing to be ashamed of, and they had better learn that first thing. The best way to remind them was to address at least part of the time as a girl. Stripping off her travel-stained clothes, she pulled on a yellow linen shift and topped it with her second-best dress, a fawn brown cotton that looked well against the yellow. She removed her boots and put on white stockings and brown leather slippers. Cleaning the mirror, she looked at herself. The gown was creased from being packed, but that could not be helped. She still had a black eye. There was nothing she could do with her mouse-brown hair. She'd had it cropped to her earlobes before she left home. Next trip to market, maybe I'll get some ribbons, she thought grimly, running a comb through her hair. Some nice, bright ribbons. She grinned at her own folly. Hadn't she learned by now that the first thing a boy grabbed in a fight was hair? She'd lose chunks of it, or get half choked if she wore ornaments and ribbons. Overhead, a bell clanged 3 times. She winced. The sound was loud. Time, Selma called. If she thought anything of the change in Kel's appearance, she kept it to herself. Instead, she pointed out yet another piece of writing. Girls can't fight. Selma's mouth twisted wryly. What do they think their mothers do when the lords are at war and a raiding party strikes? Stay in their sollers and tat lace? That made Kel smile. My aunt lit barrels of lard and had them catapulted onto Scanran ships this summer. As would any delicately reared noblewoman. Selma opened the door. Once they had walked into the hall, she took the key from Kel and went about her business, nodding to the boys as they emerged from their rooms. Kel stood in front of the door and clasped her hands so no one could see they shook. Suddenly, she wanted to turn tail and run until she reached home. Wilden was coming down the hall. Boys joined him as he passed, talking quietly. One of them was a boy with white blonde hair and blue eyes, set in a face as rosy-cheeked as a girl's. Kel, seeing the crispness of his movements and the stubbornness around his mouth, guessed that anybody silly enough to mistake that one for a girl would be quickly taught his mistake. A big, cheerful-looking red-headed boy walked on Wilden's left, joking with a very tall, lanky youth. A step behind the blonde page and Wilden came a tall boy who walked with a lion's arrogance. He was brown-skinned and black-eyed, his nose proudly arched. A Bazir tribesman from the southern desert, Kel guessed. She noticed several other Bazir among the pages, but none looked as kingly as this one. When the training master halted, there were only 5 people left in front of doors on both sides of him. 4 boys and Kel. Her next-door neighbor, a brown-haired boy, liberally sprinkled with freckles, bowed to Wilden. Kel and the others did the same. Then Kel wondered if she ought to have curtsied. She let it go. To do so now, after bowing, would only make her look silly. Wilden looked at each of them in turn, his eyes resting the longest on Kel. Don't think you'll have an easy time this year. You will work hard. You'll work when you're tired, when you're ill, and when you think you can't possibly work any more. You have 1 more day to laze. Your sponsor will show you around this palace, and collect those things which the crown supplies to you. The day after that, we begin. You, he pointed to a boy with the reddest, straightest hair Kel had ever seen. Your name and the holding of your family. The boy stammered. Merrick, sir, my lord, Merrick of Hollyrose. He had pale blue eyes and a long, broad nose. His skin had only the barest summer tan. The training master looked at the pages around him. Which of you older pages will sponsor Merrick and teach him our ways? Please, Lord Wilden. Kel wasn't able to see the owner of the voice in the knot of boys who stood at Wilden's back. We're kinsmen, Merrick and I. And kinsmen should stick together. Well said, Falarin of Kingsreach. A handsome, dark-haired boy came to stand with Merrick, smiling at the redhead. Wilden pointed to the freckled lad, Esmond of Nicoline, who was taken into the charge of Cleon of Kennan, the big redhead. Blonde, impish Quindon of Marty's Hill was sponsored by the regal-looking Bazir, Zahir ibn Alaz. The next pairing was the most notable. Crown Prince Rold, the 12-year-old heir to the throne, chose to show Seaver of Tasreed around. Seaver, whose dark complexion and coal-black eyes and hair suggested Bazir ancestors, stared at Rold nervously, but relaxed when the prince rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. Only Kel remained. Wilden demanded, Your name and your fief. She gulped. Keladry of Mindolin. Who will sponsor her? Asked Wilden. The handsome Zahir looked at her and sniffed. Girls have no business in the affairs of men. This one should go home. He glared at Kell, who met his eyes calmly. Lord Wilden shook his head. We are not among the Vizier tribes, Zahir ibn al-Az. Moreover, I requested a sponsor, not an opinion. He looked at the other boys. Will no one offer? He asked. No beginner may go unsponsored. Look at her, Kell heard a boy murmur. She stands there, like a lump. The blond youth at Wilden's side raised a hand. May I, my lord? He asked. Lord Wilden stared at him. You, Joran of Stone Mountain? The youth bowed. I would be pleased to teach the girl all she needs to know of life in the page's wing. Kell eyed him suspiciously. From the way a few older pages giggled, she suspected Joran might plan to chase her away, not show her around. She looked at the training master, expecting him to agree with the blonde page. Instead, Lord Wilden frowned. I had hoped for another sponsor, he commented stiffly. You should employ your spare hours in the improvement of your classwork and your riding skills. I thought Joran hated, someone whispered. Shut up, another boy hissed. Kell looked at the flagstones under her feet. Now she was fighting to hide her embarrassment, but she knew she was failing. Any Yamani would see her shame on her features. She clasped her hands before her and schooled her features into smoothness. I am a rock, she thought. I am stone. I believe I can perfect my studies and sponsor the girl, Joran said respectfully, and since I am the only volunteer. I suppose I am being rash and peculiar again, someone remarked in a drawling voice, but if it means helping my friend Joran improve his studies, well, I'll just have to sacrifice myself. There's nothing I won't do to further the cause of book learning among my peers. Everyone turned toward the speaker, who stood at the back of the group. Seeing him clearly, Kell thought that he was too old to be a page. He was tall, fair-skinned, and lean, with emerald eyes and light brown hair that swept back from a widow's peak. Wilden absently rubbed the arm he kept tucked in a sling. You volunteer, Neelan of Queenscove? The youth bowed jerkily. That I do, your worship, sir. There was the barest hint of a taunt in Neelan's educated voice. A sponsor should be a page in his second year at least, Wilden informed Neelan, and you will mind your tongue. I know I only joined this little band in April, your lordship, the youth Neelan remarked cheerily, but I have lived at court almost all of my 15 years. I know the palace and its ways, and unlike Joran, I need not worry about my academics. Kell stared at the youth. Had he always been mad, or did a few months under Wilden do this to him? She had just arrived, and she knew better than to bait the training master. Wilden's eyebrows snapped together. You have been told to mind your manners, Page Neelan. I will have an apology for your insolence. Neelan bowed deeply. An apology for general insolence, your lordship, or some particular offense? 1 week scrubbing pots, ordered Lord Wilden. Be silent. Neelan threw out an arm like a player making a dramatic statement. How can I be silent and yet apologize? 2 weeks. Keladry was forgotten, as Wilden concentrated on the green-eyed youth. The first duty for anyone in service to the crown is obedience. And I am a terrible obeyer, retorted Neelan. All these inconvenient arguments spring up to my head. And I just have to make them. 3, Wilden said tightly. Neil, shut it, someone whispered. I could learn, Kell squeaked. No one heard. She cleared her throat and repeated, I can learn it on my own. The boys turned to stare. Wilden glanced at her. What did you say? I'll find my way on my own, Kell repeated. Nobody has to show me. I'll probably learn better, poking around. She knew that wasn't the case. Her father had once referred to the palace as a miserable rat warren, but she couldn't let this mad boy get himself deeper into trouble on her account. Neelan stared at her, winged brows raised. When I require your opinion, began Wilden, his dark eyes snapping. It's no trouble, Neelan interrupted. Not at all. Demoiselle Keladry, my lord, I apologize for my wicked tongue and dreadful manners. I shall do my best not to encourage her to follow my example. Wilden, about to speak, seemed to think better of what he meant to say. He waited a moment, then said, You are her sponsor, then. Now, enough time has been wasted on foolishness. Supper. He strode off, pages following like ducklings in their mother's wake. When the hall cleared, only Neelan and Keladry were left. Neelan stared at the girl, his slanting eyes taking her in. Seeing him up close at last, Kel noticed that he had a willful face, with high cheekbones and arched brows. "Believe me, you wouldn't have liked Jorn as a sponsor," Neelan informed her. "He'd drive you out in a week. With me, at least, you might last a while, even if I am at the bottom of Lord Wilden's list. Come on," he strode off. Kel stayed where she was. Halfway down the hall, Neelan realized she was not behind him. When he turned and saw her still in front of her room, he sighed gustily and beckoned. Kel remained where she was. Finally, he stomped back to her. "What part of 'come on' was unclear, Paige?" "Why do you care if I last a week or longer?" she demanded. "Queen's Cove is a ducal house. Mindolin's just a barony, and a new one at that. Nobody cares about Mindolin. We aren't related, and our fathers aren't friends. So who am I to you?" Neelan stared at her. "Direct little thing, aren't you?" Kel crossed her arms over her chest and waited. The talkative boy didn't seem to have much patience. He would wear out before she did in a waiting contest. Neelan sighed and ran his fingers through his hair. "Look, you heard me say I've lived at court almost all my life, right?" Kel nodded. "Well, think about that. I've lived at court, and my father's the chief of the realm's healers. I've spent time with the queen and quite a few of the queen's riders, and the king's champion. I've watched Lady Alana fight for the crown. I saw Her Majesty and some of her ladies fight in the Immortals' War. I know women can be warriors. If that's the life you want, then you ought to have the same chance to get it as anyone else who's here." He stopped, then shook his head with a rueful smile. "I keep forgetting I'm not in any university debate. Sorry about the speech. Can we go eat now?" Kel nodded again. This time, when he strode off down the hall, she trotted to keep up with him. When they passed through an intersection of halls, Neelan pointed. "Note that stairwell. Don't let anyone tell you it's a shortcut to the mess or the classrooms. It heads straight down and ends on the lower levels underground." "Yes, sir. Don't call me sir." "Yes, sir." Neelan halted. "Was that meant to be funny?" "No, sir," Kel replied, happy to stop and catch her breath. Neelan walked as he spoke briskly. Neelan threw up his hands and resumed his course. Finally, they entered a room filled with noise. To Kel, it seemed as if every boy in the world was here, yelling and jostling around rows of long tables and benches. She came to a halt, but Neelan beckoned her to follow. He led her to stacks of trays, plates, napkins, and cutlery, grabbing what he needed. Copying him, Kel soon had a bowl of soup thick with leeks and barley, big slices of ham, a crusty roll still hot from the oven, and saffron rice studded with raisins and almonds. She had noticed pitchers of liquid, bowls of fruit, honey pots, and platters of cheese were already on the tables. As they stopped, looking for a place to sit, the racket faded. Eyes turned their way. Within seconds, she could hear the whispers. "Look, the girl. It's her." One clear voice exclaimed, "Who cares? She won't last." Kel bit her lip and stared at her tray. Stone, she thought in Umani. I am stone. Neelan gave no sign of hearing, but marched toward seats at the end of one table. As they sat across from one another, the boys closest to them moved. 2 seats beside Neelan were left empty, and 3 next to Kel. "This is nice," Neelan remarked cheerfully. He put his food on the table before him and shoved his tray into the gap between him and the next boy. "Usually it's impossible to get a bit of elbow room here." Someone rapped on a table. Lord Wilden stood alone at a lectern in front of the room. The boys and Kel got to their feet as Wilden raised his hands. "To Mithros, god of warriors and of truth, and to the great Mother Goddess, we give thanks for their bounty," he said. "We give thanks and praise," responded his audience. "We ask the guidance of Mithros in these uncertain times, when change threatens all that is time-honored and true. May the gods' light show us a path back to the virtues of our fathers, and an end to uncertain times. We ask this of Mithros, god of the sun. So mote it be," intoned the pages. Wilden lowered his hands, and the boys dropped to their seats. Kel, frowning, was less quick to sit. Had Lord Wilden been talking about her? "Don't let his prayers bother you," Neelan told her, using his belt knife to cut his meat. My father says he's done nothing but whine about changes in Tortel since the king and queen were married. Eat, it's getting cold. Kel took a few bites. After a minute, she asked, Nealon? He put down his fork. It's Neil. My least favorite aunt calls me Nealon. How did his lordship get those scars? She inquired. And why is his arm in a sling? Neil raised his eyebrows. Didn't you know? If I knew, I wouldn't ask, Kel thought irritably, but she kept her face blank. Neil glanced at her, shook his head, and continued. In the war, a party of centaurs and hurrocks. What? Asked Kel, interrupting her. Hurrocks. Winged horses, claws, fangs. Very nasty. They attacked the royal nursery. The stump. The what? Kel asked, interrupting again. She felt as if he were speaking a language she only half understood. Neil sighed. There was a wicked gleam in his green eyes. I call him the stump because he's so stiff. He might be right, but he wasn't very respectful, thought Kel. She wouldn't say so, however. She wasn't exactly sure, but probably it would be just as disrespectful to scold her sponsor, particularly one who was 5 years older than she was. Anyway, Lord Wildon fought off the hurrocks and centaurs all by himself. He saved Prince Liam, Prince Jason, and Princess Leanne. In the fight, the hurrocks raked him. My father managed to save the arm, but Wildon's going to have pain from it all his life. He's a hero, then, breathed Kel, looking at Wildon with new respect. Oh, he's as brave can be, Neil reassured her. That doesn't mean he isn't a stump. He fell silent, and Kel concentrated on her supper. Abruptly, Neil said, You aren't what was expected. How so? She cut up her meat. Oh, well, you're big for a girl. I have a 10-year-old sister who's a handwidth shorter, and you seem rather quiet. I guess I thought the girl who would follow in Lady Alana's footsteps would be more like her. Kel shrugged. Will I get to meet the lioness? She tried not to show that she would do anything to meet her hero. Neil ran his fork around the edge of his plate, not meeting Kel's eyes. She isn't often at court. Either she's in the field dealing with lawbreakers or immortals, or she's home with her family. A bell chimed. The pages rose to carry their empty trays to a long window at the back of the room, turning them over to the kitchen help. Come on, let's get rid of this stuff and I'll start showing you around. Salma found them as they were leaving the mess hall. She drew Kel aside and gave her 2 keys. One was brass, the other iron. I'm the only one with copies of these, Salma told her quietly. Even the cleaning staff will need me to let them in. Both keys are special. To open your door, put the brass one in the lock, turn it left, and whisper your name. When you leave, turn the left key again. Turn the key left again. The iron key is for the bottom set of shutters. It works the same as the door key. Lock the shutters every time you leave, or the boys will break in that way. Leave the small upper shutters open for ventilation. Only a monkey could climb through those. Don't worry if any of the boys can pick locks. Anyone who tries will be sprayed in skunk stink. That should make them reconsider. Kel smiled. Thank you, Salma. The woman nodded to her and Neil and left them. Neil walked over to Kel. If they can't wreck your room, they'll find other things to do, he murmured. When Kel raised her eyebrows at him, he explained. I learned to read lips. The masters at the university were always whispering about something. Kel tucked the keys into her belt purse. I'll deal with the other things as they come, she said firmly. Now, where to? I bet you'd enjoy the portrait gallery. If you're showing visitors around, it's one of the places they like to go. After leading Kel past a bewildering assortment of salons and libraries and official chambers, Neil showed her the gallery. He seemed to know a story about every person whose portrait was displayed there. Kel was fascinated by his knowledge of Tortel's monarchs and their families. He made it sound as if he'd known them all personally, even the most ancient. She stared longest at the faces of King Jonathan and Queen Theot. She could see why the queen was called the most beautiful woman in Tortel, but even in a painting, there was more to her than her looks. The girl saw humor at the back of those level hazel eyes and determination in the strong nose and perfectly shaped mouth. She's splendid, Kel breathed. She is, but don't say that around the stump, advised Neil. He thinks she's ruined the country with her chimera notion that women can fight and her opening schools so everyone can learn their letters. Anything new gives my Lord of Cavall a nosebleed. Still determined to go to war with the training master, Neelan? Inquired a soft, whispery voice behind Kel. She whirled, startled, and found she was staring at an expanse of pearl-gray material, as nubbly as if it were a mass of tiny beads melted together. She stumbled back one step, and then another. The pearl-gray expanse turned dark gray at the edges. Looking down, Kel saw long, slender legs ending in lengthy digits, each tipped with a silver claw. She backed up yet another step and tilted her head most of the way back. The creature was fully 7 feet tall, not counting the long tail it used to balance itself, and it was viewing her with fascination. Its large, gray, slit-pupiled eyes regarded her over a short, lipless muzzle. Kel's jaw dropped. "You're staring, Mindlin," Neil said dryly. "As am I," the creature remarked in that ghostly voice. "Will you introduce us?" "T'Ka, this is Keladry of Mindlin," said Neil. "Kel, T'Ka is a basilisk. He's also one of our instructors in the ways of the immortals." Kel had seen immortals other than the Spitterin on the riverbank, but she had never been this close to one. And he was to be one of her instructors? "We basilisks are travelers and gossips," T'Ka remarked, as if he had read her mind. "I earn my keep here by educating those who desire a more precise knowledge of those immortals who have chosen to settle in the human realms." "Yes, sir," Kel said, breathless. She started to curtsy, remembered that a page bowed, and tried to do both. Neil braced her before she could topple over. Once she had regained her balance, the red-faced Kel bowed properly. "I am pleased to meet you, Keladry of Mindlin," the basilisk told her, as if he hadn't noticed her clumsiness. "I shall see you both the day after tomorrow." With a nod to Kel and to Neil, he walked out of the gallery, tail daintily raised. Neil sighed. "We'd better get back to our rooms. Tomorrow's a busy day." He led her back to her room, pointing out his own as they passed it. "We'll meet in the mess hall in the morning," he told her. Kel used the key as Selma had directed and entered her room. Everything was in place, her bed freshly made up, curtains and draperies rehung. A faint scent of paint still drifted in from the walls. "Gods of fire and ice, bless my new home," she whispered in Yamani. "Keep my will burning as hot as the heart of the volcano, and as hard and implacable as a glacier." A wave of homesickness suddenly caught her. She wished she could hear her mother's low, soothing voice, or listen to her father read from one of his books. "Emotion is weakness," Kel told herself, quoting her Yamani teachers. "I must be as serene as a lake on a calm day." It was hard to control her feelings when so much was at stake, and she was so far from home. But control her feelings she would. If anyone here thought to run her off, they would find she was tougher than they expected. She was here to stay. To pretty cat, and set it on her mantelpiece. Only when she had placed each of them just so did she scrub her face and put on her nightgown. Climbing into bed, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She imagined a lake, its surface as smooth as glass. "This is my heart," she thought. "This is what I will strive to be." And that is the end of chapter 2 of First Test. Stay safe, everybody.